Single, Dad. Paid for her coffee. When her card was declined. He had no idea who she really was. I'm sorry, ma'am. Your card's been declined. The words rang out like a shot in the middle of the crowded cafe, simple factual, but to Camille Hartley they landed like a slap. Sharp, unexpected. She froze. Underneath her tailored trench coat and polished heels her world stumbled for just a second. Could you please try again, she said, calm, but clipped her eyes fixed on the payment terminal. A pause. Then the second chime. Declined. The young barista glanced uneasily at the growing line of commuters behind her. Camille's gaze darted downward. No wallet, no backup card. Her phone. Dead. Of all mornings, of all possible moments, today had to be the one where control slipped through her perfectly organized life. I'm terribly sorry, she said, her voice softening with an edge of genuine embarrassment. I must have left my wallet upstairs. I work in the building. Could you hold the order for just a few minutes? I'm afraid we can't hold drinks during peak hours, the barista replied, polite but firm. A sigh from somewhere in line. A muttered, come on, from a man in a tailored suit 2 spots back. No one recognized her. And for Camille that was somehow more disorienting than the declined card. Then a voice low and warm broke through the tension. I got it. She turned. A man stepped forward, mid-30s maybe. Worn navy shirt, faded jeans, scuffed black sneakers. He held a small cup of water in one hand, a debit card in the other. It's just a coffee, he said gently. Happens to the best of us. Before she could protest, he tapped the card. The machine beeped. Approved. The barista smiled with relief. The line moved again. Camille stood still, unsure of what just happened. It wasn't the cost. It wasn't pride. It was something else unraveling inside her. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly, still a little stunned. I know, he said with a shrug, but if it were me, I think you'd do the same. He handed her the coffee. Their fingers didn't touch, but there was a moment, brief, human, unfiltered, where their eyes met. The cup trembled slightly in her hand. A few drops of hot coffee splashed up and landed on her crisp white blouse. Of course, she muttered. Without a word, the man reached into his back pocket and pulled out a clean napkin. He stepped forward, not too close, and gently dabbed the stain near her collarbone. His touch was precise, respectful, the kind that knows exactly where the line is and doesn't dare cross it. There, he said softly. Almost gone. She looked up at him. His eyes were dark brown, steady with that quiet tiredness that only comes from a life lived honestly. There was no flicker of recognition in his face. He didn't know who she was. And for the first time in years, Camille felt like she could breathe. What's your name? She asked as he turned to go. He paused at the door, glanced over his shoulder. Eli, he said, then pushed through the side exit and was gone. Camille remained where she stood, coffee in one hand, the napkin in the other. The ink from the receipt bled slightly into the fibers as if marking the moment. No one had ever done that for her before. Not because she was CEO, not because they knew her name, but because for a fleeting second she was just a woman having a rough morning. 10 minutes later, Camille rode the elevator to the penthouse floor of Hartley and Mercer. The doors slid closed, the city disappeared, and she was once again surrounded by marble glass and quiet authority. But her mind wasn't on quarterly projections or investor meetings. It was downstairs, in a coffee shop, with a man named Eli. She opened her phone and tried to focus on her emails, but the image of him kept returning not for what he did, but for what he didn't do. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't stay to bask in gratitude. He simply gave, then left, like it meant nothing, like it meant everything. And Camille Hartley, who had spent years building a fortress around her time, her status, her identity, felt something shift inside her. A lock quietly unlatched. It wasn't the coffee. It was the way he walked away, as if he never expected to be remembered. But she would. She already had, and she would find him again. Camille Hartley didn't often replay moments in her mind. Her life had no use for rewinds, only forward. Decisions were made, paths chosen, days scheduled to the minute. But that morning, as she stepped out of the elevator onto the penthouse floor of Dalton Heights, something was different. The click of her heels against the marble wasn't enough to drown out the memory of him. Eli. A man with eyes that didn't scan for status. A man who handed over $6 and a napkin like it was nothing and left before she could even say thank you properly. It wasn't just kindness. It was the way he saw her. No hesitation, no flattery, just a person in a moment of need. And then he walked away as if he'd done nothing worth noticing. She couldn't stop noticing. Inside the executive suite, Camille slid into her chair at the long glass conference table. Her assistant, Mallory, had already laid out the agenda and 2 coffees, 1 oat milk, 1 black. She reached for the black by habit. "Morning," Mallory said cheerfully. "Everything all right? You look thoughtful." Camille paused mid-sip, then set the cup down. "I had an unexpected interaction this morning." "Bad, no." She glanced out the window toward the city still waking beneath a soft curtain of fog. "The opposite. Someone helped me when I wasn't recognizable." Mallory tilted her head. Like a stranger, Camille nodded slowly. "He didn't know who I was. Paid for my coffee. Walked away. That's rare." Mallory gave a half smile. "Especially here." Camille didn't answer. Her mind was already elsewhere. She turned toward the large screen on the wall where her leadership team was joining remotely. Meetings, charts, projections, all the expected rhythm. But Camille found herself watching the quiet spaces between sentences. She noticed the exhaustion in Elena's eyes from London, the way Ben from San Francisco rubbed his temple during a long forecast, the too tight smile on Ravi's face from Chicago. Strange. She'd seen these people 100 times. But today, she really looked, because one man had looked at her not for what she was, but who. Later that morning, Camille walked through the lobby on her way to another appointment. She rarely took the front entrance her car usually brought her through the secured side, but today she paused near the open atrium, letting her gaze wander. And there he was. Across the room, Eli Turner stood near a maintenance cart adjusting the height on a mop handle. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms lightly dusted with freckles and sun. He moved without rush, without apology. Like a man who wasn't trying to be noticed but wasn't afraid of being seen. Camille stepped behind one of the marble columns and watched, almost ashamed of the curiosity swelling in her chest. Eli wasn't doing anything special. He wiped down a handrail, smiled briefly at the building concierge, picked up a crumpled cup someone had tossed near a planter. But every motion held something she couldn't name. If it were me, you'd do the same. Would she? She didn't know. But the question unsettled her. Back in her office, Camille opened her laptop and navigated to the internal system. Her fingers hesitated. Was she invading his privacy? No, just verifying a name. She typed Eli Turner. Only one profile came up. Position building maintenance. Contract employee. Years of service. 2. Supervisor Roger L. McKay. Employee. Notes. Punctual. Quiet. No formal complaints. No educational background listed. No prior experience detailed. Just a name and a number. Camille clicked back. Something didn't fit. His words. His posture. The way he carried himself. It wasn't how people acted when life had worn them down. It was how people acted when they'd made peace with the weight they carried. She reached for her phone. "Mallory, can you pull a list of former engineering applicants from the last 2 years? I want to re-review a few files. All of them. Just the ones flagged for incomplete history or employment gaps." There was a pause. Understood. That evening, the office was emptying. Camille sat cross-legged in her chair, flipping through printed resumes, a red pen in hand. She'd made a habit of doing this late at night, searching for stories between the lines of bullet points and job titles. and then she saw it. Turner, Eli J. Former title, Senior Systems Engineer. Velar Tech duration, 8 years notable projects, QuantumNet infrastructure design, Cloud Bridge redundancy overhaul, gap 3 years, explanation, personal leave. The application had been rejected automatically. A red line through the front page. A note scribbled in the margin, no clear explanation for leave. Skills outdated. Camille stared at the file. Velar Tech was no small firm, and QuantumNet. She remembered the rollout. Clean, efficient, ahead of its time. She turned to the final page, one short comment in the additional notes section. Looking to re-enter the tech world at my own pace. Not looking for pity, just purpose. Camille closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glowed in soft, amber light. Somewhere down there, people hurried home, chasing warmth, chasing rest. But she wasn't thinking about cities or forecasts or shareholder calls. She was thinking about a man who had once built systems for companies now worth billions, and who now quietly wiped down glass doors for people who never looked twice. He hadn't asked for anything. He never once said, "I used to be somebody." And somehow that made him more than anybody she'd met this year. The next morning, Camille stood by the elevator with a decision already made. "Mallory," she said, holding the folder in one hand, "cancel the panel interview for Thursday." Mallory blinked. "The tech consultant one." Camille nodded. "Bring him to me directly. No panel, no layers, just him and me." Mallory hesitated. "That's unusual." Camille looked up, her voice clear. "So is he." The folder sat unopened on Camille's desk for nearly 20 minutes. It wasn't that she lacked time. It was something else, something that tugged at her chest each time her fingers grazed the edge of the manila cover. A feeling she wasn't used to hesitation. Camille Hartley didn't hesitate. She was the type to leap where others studied, decide while others debated. But this wasn't business. This was something personal disguised in a file, a name printed in black ink. Eli J. Turner, the man who paid for her coffee, the man who left before she could thank him, the man who held a quiet dignity so rare it felt like an echo from another era. With a quiet exhale, she opened the folder. The first page was unimpressive. Standard resume format. A little outdated. A cover letter brief but articulate. No flair, no corporate lingo, no unnecessary pleasantries. Just this after a personal hiatus, I'm looking to contribute again in the field I love. I don't expect pity or favors. I simply want the chance to earn what I've always valued: purpose and honest work. Camille paused. She turned to the second page. List of projects. Systems analysis, cross-platform integration infrastructure audits. All high-level, all solid. She saw the names Velar Tech, Halberd Systems, Cloud Bridge. She remembered those launches. Back-end successes no one celebrated in the media, but that her industry insiders raved about. He hadn't listed titles in bold, just dates, contributions, results, no self-promotion, no inflation. 8 years of excellence. Then a 3-year silence. Camille flipped to the final page. Reason for leave read simply, "Family matter. Will explain in interview if needed." There was a note handwritten in red ink in the HR margin gap, too long. No explanation. Discard. She stared at that word. Discard. They didn't even call. Didn't ask. Just tossed aside the story behind the silence. Tossed aside the man behind the story. Camille leaned back, fingers tapping slowly on her chair's leather armrest. Something wasn't right. She turned to her computer, logged into the company's internal portal, and searched for archived applications. Then, out of instinct, maybe something closer to hope, she opened a browser and typed in Eli Turner, Blaha, Velar Tech. At first, nothing. Then, an old press release popped up, his name among a list of engineers credited with stabilizing a large-scale network during a Northeast outage. Next, a blog post. Comments from peers. Then, finally, a link buried deep in a local news archive. Local engineer steps away after tragic loss. Her breath caught. She clicked. A photo loaded slowly. There he was, 4 years younger but unmistakably him. Standing in front of a small memorial candles flickering a child's photograph pinned among white roses. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit. His hands were folded. His eyes empty. Camille didn't need to read the full article. The headline told enough. His wife and young son had died in a freeway accident. He had stepped away from everything days later. He never came back. Not until now. Her throat tightened. She wasn't someone who cried easily, not for stories, not for headlines. But this wasn't a story. It was a man who had chosen silence over spectacle. A man who had endured something that shattered most and rebuilt his life piece by piece from the ground floor of the building he once might have owned. And now, because of a 3-year gap, someone had stamped a red mark on his name. Discard. No, not anymore. She grabbed a black pen, crossed out the red line. In its place she wrote, Priority Candidate, CEO Interview, Direct Only. There was a quiet knock at her door. Come in, Camille said. Mallory peeked in holding 2 new files. More consultant applications if you still want them. Camille shook her head. Set those aside. I've made my choice. Mallory blinked. Already, you haven't even met the others. I don't need to, Camille said, standing. I've read what matters. Mallory placed the files on a side table. You want me to set up a panel like usual? No panel. No HR buffer? Camille handed her the file. Just him. Me. Thursday at 2. Mallory looked down at the name. This one was in the rejected pile. Not anymore, Camille said. That evening, Camille sat alone in her office, the city aglow behind her. She thought about how easily someone's life could be reduced to bullet points. Dates, gaps, words like discarded and incomplete. She thought about how many people never got seen simply because they didn't fit the algorithm. And then she thought about the man who gave her a coffee, who handed her a napkin like it meant something, who looked at her as a person, not a paycheck. And for the first time in a long time, Camille Hartley felt like she wasn't running a company. She was leading it. Quietly, deliberately, she opened her planner and circled Thursday. Underneath, she wrote, Interview Eli Turner. Read him, not the resume. The elevator climbed slowly, too slowly for Eli's liking. He stood stiffly in the corner, hands folded in front of him, clutching the only folder he owned that looked remotely professional. It held nothing new. Just his resume, already printed twice by HR, already read, and presumably dismissed once before. Still, he brought it, out of habit, out of the part of him that still hoped to be seen whole. He watched the numbers tick upward, 22, 23, 24. He had never been this high in the building before. His usual route ended on 5, where supply closets outnumbered windows. When the elevator chimed at the top floor, he stepped out into quiet. The hallway smelled of lemon and cedar. The lighting was warm, understated. Art lined the walls, real art, not motivational posters. There were no crowds, no assistant waiting to usher him into a boardroom. Just a single door cracked open with his name printed neatly on a card outside Eli Turner, 2:00 p.m., with CEO. He paused, exhaled, then knocked gently. Come in. The voice was calm, smooth, familiar and yet different now, like hearing music played in a quiet room after only ever hearing it on the street. He stepped inside. The office was all glass and light, sleek surfaces and thoughtful design. 2 chairs faced each other across a low table. A tray with 2 cups of tea sat between them, steam rising gently from both. At the far window stood Camille Hartley. She turned when he entered, her expression unreadable at first, then warm. Almost too warm. Mr. Turner, she said with a nod. Thank you for coming. Of course, he replied, voice steady. I have to admit, I didn't expect this. Neither did I, she said softly. A flicker of surprise passed through his eyes, but she gestured for him to sit before he could ask more. They took their seats. There was a long pause. Not awkward, just still. A kind of quiet that demanded both presence and patience. Camille was the first to speak. "You were originally scheduled for a panel interview," she said. "Standard protocol. But I asked for this instead. Just us." "May I ask why?" Eli said. She met his gaze. Her eyes were steady, thoughtful. "Because panels read resumes. I wanted to read a person." He didn't smile, but something behind his eyes shifted like a door quietly unlatched. She reached for the folder between them. "I reviewed your file. Velar Tech, Halberd Systems, QuantumNet. Your work speaks for itself. But then there's a gap, 3 years. Most people didn't look past it." Eli nodded once. "I didn't expect them to." "You wrote, 'I'm not looking for pity, just purpose.'" That stayed with me. He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I meant it. Would you be willing to share what happened?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed his hands on his knees, fingers tightening slightly. "Then I lost my wife and my son in a car accident. I stepped away from work to survive." Camille didn't respond with the usual, "I'm so sorry." Instead, she simply nodded. Not in sympathy. In understanding. Eli continued. "For a long time, I couldn't fix anything. Not even the smallest things. I'd built systems worth millions, but I couldn't get out of bed. Couldn't pack a school lunch without breaking. And then, slowly, I started cleaning. At first, just the house. Then my friend's store. Then buildings, floors, windows, things I could fix with my hands when my heart had nothing left." Camille said nothing, but her eyes burned. Eli exhaled. "When I finally had enough strength to re-enter the world I left behind, I realized the world didn't exactly hold a seat for me anymore. Skills moved on. So did hiring managers." She took a sip of her tea, then set the cup down carefully. "You're overqualified for half the roles we have open. You know that, right? Yes, so why apply for one of them?" He smiled faintly. "Because it wasn't about climbing again. I just wanted to stand again." There was silence again, this time full of weight, respect, something else. Camille leaned back slightly, fingers intertwined. "I didn't bring you here to offer pity, and I'm not interested in saving anyone." "Good," he replied, "because I'm not interested in being saved." That made her laugh. Quiet real. "I wanted to meet the man who saw a stranger struggling over a cup of coffee and didn't make it about himself, who didn't try to impress or linger or collect some invisible credit." Eli looked down, then up again. "It didn't feel like something I needed thanks for." "But it was," she said gently. "Because for the first time in a long time someone saw me not as a title or a salary or an obligation, but as a human being in a moment of need." Eli's brow softened. "You looked capable. Just tired." "I was both," she admitted, "and no one ever calls that out. Not like that." He looked at her more fully now. The woman across from him wasn't the tightly wound executive from his assumptions. She looked steady, yes, but also worn. Not in weakness, in effort. There was something in her silence that reminded him of himself. She reached for a second folder, sleek black, no red pen in sight. "This isn't for an entry-level role," she said. "It's for lead systems consultant. High stakes, demanding. But if you accept, you'll be exactly where you belong." Eli hesitated, then opened the folder. He read the offer, then looked up, expression unreadable. "You're serious?" "I am. You barely know me." Camille smiled. "That's not true. I know you better than most candidates I've hired in years, because I've seen you clean what others step over, and I've watched how you carry what most people can't name. That tells me more than any reference ever could." He closed the folder and set it gently on the table. "I'll accept," he said, then paused, "but only on one condition." She raised an eyebrow. "Let me pay for the next coffee." Camille let out a soft, surprised laugh. Deal. When he left the office, the sky outside had shifted. The late afternoon sun poured across the marble floors, casting long shadows behind him. And for the first time in a long time, Eli Turner didn't feel like a man passing through glass doors. He felt like a man who might one day build them. The offer letter sat on Eli's kitchen table unopened. He stared at it as he washed the dinner dishes, his hands moving through warm water and soap, methodical, slow. The clatter of a fork against the sink broke the stillness. The radio hummed low in the background, playing something soft and old. Something his wife used to sing along with when no one was watching. Across the room, his daughter Lily sat cross-legged on the floor drawing. Crayons scattered her tongue, peeking out in concentration as she worked on what looked like a house surrounded by stars. He dried his hands, picked up the envelope, read the name again. Camille Hartley, CEO, Mercer Digital. Not just a coffee then, not just a moment, not just a woman with a card that failed and a stain on her blouse. That morning at the office had felt surreal. Her presence, so composed and certain, had made him feel like a man stumbling into someone else's world. But the way she'd looked at him really looked he hadn't felt beneath her. He'd felt seen. Still, now that the quiet had returned, doubt crept in like cold through an old window. Could he really do this again? Could he sit in meetings, build systems, carry weight that wasn't just personal, but professional again? He opened the envelope. The salary was generous, more than enough to pull them out of the edge-of-scraping-by mode he'd lived in for years. But it wasn't the numbers that struck him. It was the handwritten note tucked behind the formal papers. You earned this not in spite of the years you stepped away, but because of how you came back. Don't doubt it. No signature, just that. He set it down, looked over at Lily. Hey, Bug, he called. She looked up. Do you remember the day I forgot your lunch and we had to share the vending machine peanuts? She giggled, and we made it a tea party at the bus stop. He smiled. Would it be okay if I started a new job? One that means I might be home a little later some nights, but it's something I used to love. She nodded, then tilted her head. Will you still make pancakes on Sundays every Sunday? Then it's okay. He reached out and pulled her close, pressing a kiss into her hair. Maybe it was time. Maybe finally the world had made space again. The next day, Eli returned to Dalton Heights not as a janitor, not with a mop cart or a supply list, but in slacks and a buttoned shirt that still held the faint scent of starch. His new badge read E. Turner, Technical Strategy Consultant. He touched it once before entering the elevator. Up. He noticed the stairs in the hallway. Some recognized him. A few frowned. Some smiled awkwardly, uncertain if they should greet him differently now. It didn't matter. He wasn't here for recognition. He passed by the floor he used to clean, past the supply closet he once organized just to keep his hands busy, and walked into a new space. The 22nd floor was quiet but buzzing beneath the surface like the moment before a song begins. Camille wasn't there, but a desk had already been prepared for him, tucked near the corner with a large whiteboard, dual monitors, and a sticky note that read, No rush. But we're glad you're here. C.H. He smiled at the brevity. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't trying to own the moment. She had just opened a door and let him step through. The first few days were quiet. He spoke little, listened a lot. People underestimated silence. But silence, Eli had learned, was a kind of data. It told you what people didn't know, what they feared, where the gaps were. He reviewed outdated protocols, mapped out infrastructure pain points. Not publicly, not loudly, just thoroughly. Sometimes Camille passed by. She never lingered, never hovered, but once she paused just long enough to say, I heard about the outdated cache servers you flagged. That's been causing problems for months. He nodded. They're not built wrong, he said. They're just built without thinking about who has to carry the weight when they fail. She smiled faintly. People don't usually talk about systems like they have a soul. They don't, Eli replied. But people do. And people build them. She didn't say anything after that. But the next morning, a new license was added to his work profile, access to deeper architecture files that had been previously locked. No email, no announcement, just a silent invitation to go deeper. One night, Eli stayed late long after the office lights dimmed, after even the hum of printers had stilled. He was reviewing old deployment logs when a soft knock came at the glass wall of his cubicle. Camille stood there holding 2 mugs, chamomile tea. No words. She placed one on his desk, then turned to leave. "Wait," he said. She turned. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Why me?" She looked at him for a long moment, then sat down across from him. "Because you remind me that kindness doesn't need to be loud to matter." He said nothing. "And because people like you, they don't just fix systems. They restore faith." He met her gaze. "I'm not trying to be noble," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to do something that means something." Again, that she whispered is exactly what nobility looks like. They sat there for a long while, sipping tea, letting silence do the rest. That night, as Eli walked to the bus stop, the city lights shimmered across rain-slick streets. He felt no lightning strike, no cinematic soundtrack swelling beneath his feet. But something inside him had shifted. The silence he used to carry like armor now felt like space. Space for something to begin again. Not from nothing, but from everything he had survived. The ballroom at the Mercer Gala shimmered under 1,000 lights. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden reflections across polished floors. Champagne glasses clinked softly as laughter bounced off high ceilings. Waiters in black carried silver trays weaving through a sea of tailored suits and backless gowns. It was the 10th anniversary of Mercer Digital, a celebration of growth resilience and Camille Hartley's unshakable leadership. And yet, as she stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, smiling politely, shaking hands with investors and board members, Camille felt oddly detached, like she was watching herself perform a role she'd outgrown. She had orchestrated every detail of the event, the string quartet near the dais, the curated menu, even the custom lighting design that made every photo look like a magazine cover. But something in her felt unlit. Her shoulders ached under the weight of the midnight blue gown. Her hair in elegant waves felt too carefully placed. Her eyes scanned the room not for praise but for someone who hadn't yet arrived. Then, like a note held just long enough before a chord change, he appeared. Eli. He stepped in through the service corridor dressed in a simple black tuxedo, no tie. Clean, understated. A man who didn't need to announce himself to be noticed. Camille saw him before he saw her. He paused at the edge of the room, adjusting his cuffs slightly, scanning the crowd not for importance but for purpose. He looked like he was still deciding if he truly belonged. She crossed the room. Before she could say anything, a cold breeze swept in from the north-facing balcony. Camille instinctively pulled her arms in against the bare, open back of her dress. Eli noticed, and without a word, he stepped forward and draped a deep navy wrap over her shoulders. She looked up at him, startled by the warmth not just of the fabric, but of the gesture. "You always notice," she said softly. "I pay attention," he replied, "especially when no one else is." She held the wrap in place, but his fingers lingered a half-second too long against her arm. It wasn't intimacy. It was reverence. And for Camille that felt far rarer. Before she could respond, a hush fell over the room. The final toast was made. The quartet struck its last note. Then, a soft announcement: guests are invited to the South Terrace for the fireworks show. People began to move. Camille turned to Eli. "Come with me." They stepped out into the night. The air was cool and smelled faintly of jasmine and distant smoke. The terrace overlooked the skyline, now painted in shades of navy and gold. Across the river, the first firework exploded a bloom of red, crackling quietly before fading into sparks. Camille exhaled. Every year I stand here for this part, she said. Smile at the cameras. Pretend like the show means something. Eli glanced at her, and this year she looked out at the sky. Another burst this time in silver and blue. This year it actually does. He said nothing. You know what I've learned, she said, voice lower now, more herself. People think leadership is about control, about always being right, always ahead. But lately, I've been wondering if it's actually about noticing. The way you do. Eli turned to her fully now. Noticing doesn't take power, he said. It takes presence. Most people don't stay long enough to really see. She looked at him. Not at his clothes or his resume or his silence, but at him. The man who had once paid for her coffee without asking for anything in return. The man who still looked like he'd rather be underestimated than misunderstood. You know, she said softly when you first handed me that napkin, it wasn't the gesture that stayed with me. It was the care. Like you knew where the edge was and refused to cross it. I've lived on that edge, he said. You learned to respect it. A long pause. Why are you always so careful, she asked, not accusing, but genuinely curious. He looked back at the sky as another firework scattered gold across the clouds. Because I know what it feels like when no one is careful with you. The words landed somewhere deep inside her. Not just heard, felt. Camille reached for his hand, not dramatically, not for show, but quietly, intentionally. Their fingers met like puzzle pieces that had always belonged. Thank you, she whispered. Eli didn't ask what for. He simply squeezed her hand gently. Always. They stood there side by side as the sky broke open with light. Red, blue, silver, gold. Reflections shimmered in the glass behind them, but neither of them looked back. After a long moment, Camille turned slightly. What would you have done if we never met that day at the café? Eli considered. I think we still would have met. Maybe in an elevator. Or at the coffee machine. Or the hallway you used to rush past. She smiled. You think everything's meant to be? No, he said. I think some things happen because someone decides to stay in the moment. Long enough to matter. She looked at him. Then really looked. Not as an employee. Not as a charity case, but as a man who had rebuilt himself from silence and taught her to listen to her own. The crowd behind them began to trickle back inside. Laughter returned, glasses refilled, but Camille and Eli lingered. One more firework bloomed. She leaned into him, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. He didn't move. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like she was leading a company or commanding a room or proving her worth. She simply felt held, seen, still. The storm didn't begin with thunder. It began with a leak. An internal memo from one of Mercer Digital's regional offices marked confidential had somehow made its way to the media. Within hours, blogs picked it up. Then analysts. Then morning news anchors. The memo, dry in tone but sharp in implication, questioned the company's leadership direction regarding an upcoming merger. Words like misalignment, top-down restructuring, and overreach were bolded in red boxes by every commentator with a keyboard and a hot take. By 9:30 a.m., Camille's inbox had exploded. By 10:15, the board had called an emergency meeting. And by 10:30, she was seated at the head of a long, cold conference table surrounded by people who suddenly forgot how to look her in the eye. The walls were glass. The skyline beyond them blazed with sun, but inside the air was tight and sharp. The kind of silence that comes before blame gets passed around like a hot coin. She didn't flinch as the first salvo came. Camille, do you know how this got out? This kind of breach undermines investor confidence. Wasn't this part of your team's internal alignment protocol? She answered each question calmly, precisely, without raising her voice, but she felt it the shift. The way people you've built empires with could suddenly edge their chairs a little farther from yours the moment the fire starts. And just like that, the tone sharpened. "We need to reevaluate the communication strategy at the executive level," said one board member with a practiced frown. "Perhaps it's time to revisit leadership accountability." Camille's hand tightened around her pen. She didn't respond. Not yet, not when they wanted her to. But across the room, someone shifted. Eli. He hadn't been invited to speak. He was there to observe as part of his consultant briefing. But now he leaned forward, one elbow resting on the table, eyes level and steady. "If we're questioning leadership," he said, "let's at least be accurate." Heads turned. Some looked confused, others annoyed. But Eli didn't blink. This leak wasn't from her office. It wasn't authored by her, reviewed by her, or even seen by her. It came from a regional team that's been flagged twice for skipping policy review. "Silence," he went on. And while most people here were still sipping their first espresso, she was in her office. At 6:30, not cleaning up a mess she made, but one she inherited. Alone. One board member opened their mouth, closed it. Eli's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. So, unless anyone at this table has logged more hours than she has this week, unless you've missed your own daughter's recital or skipped dinner 4 nights straight, maybe what we need isn't scapegoating. Maybe what we need is a mirror. The room went still. Camille turned her head slightly toward him. Her face revealed nothing but inside something broke and softened at once. A pause. Then Camille finally spoke. Her voice measured, calm, but different now, steadier. "Thank you, Mr. Turner." A few murmured acknowledgments followed. Some changed the subject. Others pretended to take notes. But the tone of the meeting had shifted irreversibly. She had been defended by the man who once cleaned this floor, not out of loyalty, but out of truth. After the meeting, Camille lingered behind, stacking papers slowly. Eli stood by the door as if waiting to make sure the room had truly emptied before speaking. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. Less guarded. More real. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He tilted his head. "Yes, I did." She crossed her arms, not defensively, but like someone containing emotion too fragile to spill in public. "Why?" "Because you were alone," he said simply. "And I know what that feels like." There it was again. The way he said things with so few words and yet left nowhere to hide. She looked at him, eyes searching. "You really believe that's enough? Just showing up?" Eli stepped closer, not in challenge, in presence. That's where everything starts. A long silence filled the space between them, and then her shoulders eased, not in surrender, but in permission. Permission to not hold everything up for once, to let someone stand beside her without questioning the cost. Later that day, she found herself walking down the hall alone, heels softer than usual against the carpet. She paused outside the analytics wing and saw Eli through the glass crouched beside a younger employee, Mia, from the data team. Her eyes were red, shoulders hunched, a clear sign of a quiet breakdown. Eli didn't say much, just sat with her, waited. Then he said something Camille couldn't hear, but whatever it was, Mia nodded slowly. Her breathing evened. Her fingers stopped trembling. Camille didn't need to hear the words. She recognized the rhythm. It was the same one Eli had used with her. Not fixing, not saving, just staying. That night, Camille sat in her office overlooking the city. The sun had dipped below the skyline, painting everything in hues of rust and lavender. She opened her laptop and drafted an internal memo, not to defend herself, not to shift blame, but to reaffirm a principle. Leadership begins in quiet places. In how we show up when no one is watching. We are not perfect, but we are present. And that is where trust begins. She didn't sign it with her title, just her name. Then, after a long pause, she sent it. And for the first time that day, she allowed herself a breath that wasn't laced with urgency. That evening, as she and Eli crossed paths in the lobby, she stopped. He was just about to leave, coat in hand, the air between them still warm from earlier. "Thank you," she said again, softer this time. He met her eyes. "You already said that. I didn't mean for the meeting." He waited. She hesitated, then added, "I meant for seeing me. Not the version of me they all see, the one under the wrap, the one who sometimes forgets how to stand." He didn't smile. He just nodded once. "Then, I guess we're even." "How so?" He looked at her for a long moment. "You saw me when I wasn't even sure I still existed." She blinked, the words sinking into her chest like warmth after cold. Then she smiled. Soft, quiet, real. This job, this place, this world, we don't reward people who see. That's why it matters when someone finally does, Eli said. And with that, he walked out into the night. But this time, she didn't feel like he was walking away. She felt like he was walking with her, even from down the hall. It was nearly 7:15 p.m. Most of the building had gone quiet, save for the low hum of distant printers and the soft buzz of motion sensor lights. Eli Turner walked the long hallway past the analytics department, intending only to grab a report he'd left behind. But something made him stop. A muffled sound. He turned, looking through the clear glass panel of a half-lit cubicle. Mia, the youngest member of the data team. Brilliant with numbers, quick with code, but young in the way that made failure feel fatal. She sat hunched over her keyboard, eyes glassy, trying to type while discreetly wiping her cheeks with the cuff of her sweater. Her screen glowed red, an error message blinking over a report she'd clearly tried to fix more than once. Eli hesitated, then quietly stepped in. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. Instead, he pulled a chair across from her and sat down slowly, his presence deliberate but unintrusive, like placing a warm mug on a cold table. She startled slightly, wiping her face again. I'm fine," she said quickly. "Just a long day." Eli gave a quiet nod. "Looks like it." He glanced at the screen. Numbers misaligned. A formula looped back on itself. Nothing catastrophic, but she looked like it was the end of her world. She lowered her gaze. "I messed up a client report. It goes out in the morning, and I thought I could fix it." But her voice cracked. "I don't even know what I'm doing anymore." Eli didn't move, didn't correct her, didn't fill the silence. After a long pause, he leaned back, eyes still gentle. "You think the rest of us never mess up?" She let out a dry laugh. "You please. You always look so calm, like nothing gets to you." Eli tilted his head slightly. "I once shipped a patch to a live product that crashed an entire server cluster for 3 days. Her eyes widened. "Seriously, cost the company 6 figures. I thought I'd never work in tech again." She stared at him, unsure if he was joking. He wasn't. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Eli smiled faintly. "Someone older than me sat down. Said, 'You're allowed to fail. You're just not allowed to disappear.'" Mia swallowed hard. He leaned forward slightly. "So, don't disappear." A long pause. She nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders beginning to ease. Eli pointed gently at the screen. "Let's take a look together. You fix the formula, I'll double-check the logic." She blinked. "You don't have to, I know," he said. "That's not why I'm here." She exhaled, and for the first time that night her hands stopped trembling. They worked together in silence. 20 minutes, a few lines of cleaned-up code, a formula realigned, error cleared. The screen turned green. Mia let out a breath like she'd been holding it all day. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli stood pushing in the chair. "Not a rescue," he said. "Just company." She nodded, eyes fuller now, but not with tears. With steadiness. From down the hallway, Camille had stopped. She'd come looking for Eli to check on a timeline revision, but what she saw through the glass held her in place. She watched the way he didn't rush Mia. The way he didn't correct her from a place of ego. He simply stayed. Quiet, grounded, real. Camille didn't move for a long time, because it hit her this was leadership. Not the kind with press releases and keynotes, not the kind that wore tailored suits and won applause, the kind that sat across from someone when they were falling apart and simply said, "I'm here. Let's fix it together." Later that evening, Camille caught up with Eli by the elevator. He was holding a takeout bag in one hand, probably something quick for him and Lily. His coat was slightly rumpled, his hair tousled from a day that had clearly gone long. "She's lucky you were there," Camille said softly. He glanced at her. "We've all been there." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, "You make me rethink how I lead." He raised an eyebrow, gently amused. "I doubt that." She stepped a little closer. "I used to think leadership meant being the first in the room, the loudest voice, the last to crack." She hesitated. "But then I watched you sit with someone who thought she was failing, and you didn't tell her what to do. You just reminded her she didn't have to face it alone." Eli shrugged eyes, thoughtful. Leadership doesn't start with power. It starts with presence. Camille felt those words sink into her like warmth in cold hands. "You sound like someone who's practiced that line." He shook his head. "No," he said. "I've just lived the opposite." They stood there in the quiet. Then she added, "Most people teach by leading from the front, but I think you lead by walking alongside." He didn't reply. He didn't have to. Outside, the city hummed with late-evening life cars passing neon flickering people on their way to places that would forget them the moment they left. Eli opened the car door for her. Her car was in the shop, and when he'd offered her a ride earlier she'd said yes without hesitation. Not because she needed it, but because she wanted the company. Inside, the car was quiet. A soft instrumental track played from the radio, one of those wordless songs that somehow said more than lyrics ever could. Camille leaned back against the seat, letting her body relax for the first time in hours. "You were right," she murmured. He glanced at her. "About what you don't have to say much to change something for someone." He smiled slightly. "Neither do you." She turned to him, eyes warmer now. "You notice more than people think you do." He looked forward again. "I used to miss things," he said. "Now I try not to." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes growing heavy. The rhythm of the road, the softness of the moment, it all lulled her towards sleep. And she let it. At the next red light, Eli turned slightly. Camille had dozed off, her face turned toward the window, hair loose against her cheek. A strand had caught at the corner of her lips. He reached out, paused hand hovering just an inch away, and then gently he brushed the hair aside. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment she didn't move, didn't speak. Their eyes met, his hand still near her cheek. He began pulling back, flustered. "Sorry, your hair." She didn't look away. "It's okay," she said, her voice barely above a breath. She watched him as if seeing something unfold she hadn't dared name before. The traffic light turned green, but neither of them was in a rush to move forward, because in that quiet car on an ordinary street something extraordinary had just begun to shift. Not with declarations, but with presence. The city woke slowly the next morning, but Camille was already seated by her office window, coffee cooling beside her untouched. She had replayed the night before a dozen times in her mind, not just the warmth of Eli's car or the way silence had filled the space like soft light, but that brief, almost sacred moment when their eyes met and neither of them turned away. It hadn't been a confession. It hadn't needed to be. But it had been something real. And now, as the office buzzed back to life outside her glass walls, Camille found herself staring at a sentence she had typed and deleted 3 times already. Leadership is the art of what for years she'd filled that blank with words like vision control, decisiveness. But none of those felt true anymore. Not after watching Eli help Mia without fanfare. Not after hearing him defend her in the storm room without waiting for credit. Not after the way he'd brushed a strand of hair from her cheek like he was handling something irreplaceable. She turned back to the sentence. Leadership is the art of seeing without assumption, staying without agenda, and speaking only when your words carry care. She paused, then clicked save. That afternoon, Camille and Eli found themselves walking down the same hallway again, side by side. She was holding her tablet scrolling through team performance metrics, but her eyes kept drifting toward him. He noticed. "You're unusually quiet today," he said. "I'm thinking." "About?" She stopped mid-stride, lowering her tablet. "You." Eli raised an eyebrow, surprised. "That direct, huh?" She smiled. "I'm learning to skip the part where we pretend we're not already thinking about the same things." He chuckled under his breath. "All right, I'll bite." "What about me?" Camille tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I used to think I had to lead from out front, keep my head down, my heart tucked in, always 2 steps ahead. But then I watched you just sit with someone who was falling apart. And you didn't fix her. You didn't control the moment. You shared it." Eli looked at her brow, furrowed gently. It didn't feel like a leadership move. That's because it wasn't one she said. It was a human move. And that's what made it powerful. They stood in the corridor, the usual rush of staff passing them unnoticed. "You know," she added, "for all the noise in this place, it's the quiet things that have changed it most." "Maybe because quiet is where truth hides," he said. She looked at him. Then, not just professionally, not as a woman intrigued by a man she admired, but as someone profoundly changed by his presence. "You're not just here to help us build better systems," she said softly. "You're here to help us remember why we build them." He held her gaze. Steady, present. "And you're not just here to lead the company," he said. "You're here to remind people it's still made of people." She smiled, but there was a hint of sadness there too. "I've spent so long being efficient that I forgot how to be available." "Then it's a good thing someone reminded you." She tilted her head. "And what reminded you?" He looked out the window for a long moment before answering. "Loss," he said quietly. "Losing everything strips the noise. You remember what matters. You stop chasing applause and start choosing presence." Camille didn't speak. She just nodded as if every word had landed exactly where it needed to. Later that day, they sat in a strategy session. It was Eli's first time leading the table. Senior execs, IT heads, project directors, all eyes on him. He wore a charcoal blazer, no tie. Still him unpretentious steady. He stood at the smart screen and began outlining his vision for a more integrated, human-centered digital infrastructure. "We've been focusing on efficiency," he said, "which is fine until you start measuring people the same way you measure bandwidth." A few raised eyebrows. He continued, "We can cut redundancies and improve system flow. That's easy. But what we should be doing is designing infrastructure that supports the people using it, not punishes them for human error." Someone shifted in their seat. "What are you proposing, exactly?" a director asked. Eli pulled up a heat map of user activity. "We need to design for real people with real work rhythms, not idealized ones. The current setup assumes perfect behavior. But when the system fails, it's not just a tech issue, it becomes a human one." He paused. "So let's start building systems that assume people will need help and give it before they ask." The room was silent. Not because they didn't understand, because they did. And they weren't used to being challenged in a way that felt gentle. From the back, Camille watched, and when the presentation ended, she stood. No speech, no preamble, just this: "I read his file, and then I read between the lines." She looked around the room. "But today, you all just read the room." She turned to Eli, her voice softer now, but clear. "I chose right." There was a beat of stunned silence, then applause. Not thunderous, but true. Eli didn't smile. not right away. He simply nodded, gathered his notes, and returned to his seat. But something in his chest expanded. Slowly, quietly, the way light seeps under a closed door. That night, Camille found herself alone again at her window. The city pulsed below, but her world had gone still. She didn't feel exhausted. She felt aligned, as if a piece of her that had long gone missing had returned not in a blaze but in a man who sat with others when they were breaking and reminded her that she could too. She reached for her notebook, scribbled a single line. "The best leaders don't move ahead of us. They move with us. Step by step, breath by breath." She underlined it twice, then finally turned out the light. And somewhere on the other side of the city, Eli sat at his own kitchen table helping Lily finish her homework. Neither of them knew how the rest of the story would unfold, but both of them knew this. They were no longer walking alone. It was the kind of afternoon that tasted like endings. Gray sky, heavy clouds, a slow drizzle painted the glass of Mercer Tower in a blur of fading ambition. Inside, everything buzzed just slightly too loud, printer whirs, elevator chimes, the soft anxiety of people waiting for shoes to drop. Camille stood at the edge of the executive floor staring at the door she had never opened not once in 10 years. It was her father's office, locked since the day he'd died. Most of the team assumed it was a storage room now, a relic. But to Camille, it was a shrine, and today she had the key, not the one made of metal, but the one carved from healing. Eli had noticed the shift in her days ago, the way her silences were fuller, not colder, the way her presence now took up space without force, and the way her gaze often drifted toward that door like it whispered to her. He didn't ask, but today she came to him. "Would you come with me?" she asked, standing in the hallway, her voice steady but quiet. He looked at her for a beat, then nodded once. "Of course." The key turned with a click that echoed louder than it should have. The air inside smelled faintly of old paper and cedar. Time didn't live here. It waited. The room was untouched. Polished wood desk, wall of accolades, a photo of a younger Camille standing beside her father at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. She couldn't have been more than 16. She wore braces and pride like armor. Eli stepped back, giving her space. But he didn't leave. Camille walked to the desk slowly, her hand brushing the back of her father's old leather chair. "He built this company from nothing," she murmured. Eli nodded. "And you carried it farther." She didn't turn. Her eyes stayed on the portrait. "People think I became who I am because of him," she said. "But the truth is, I became who I am trying to prove I deserved to be here after he was gone." A long pause. Then, turning slowly, she looked at Eli. "Every decision I've made, every sacrifice, I was building something that I didn't know how to feel part of. I kept telling myself I had to be steel. That softness was weakness. That presence made you vulnerable." He watched her closely, not interrupting, just witnessing. Her voice dropped. "But then I met a man who ran headfirst into vulnerability and never used it to ask for anything. He just stayed with people in their worst moments, like their pain wasn't something to fix, but something to honor." Eli blinked slowly. The words were too close. Camille stepped toward him. "You changed the way I understand power," she said softly. "You reminded me, it's not what we hold, it's what we share." Her hands trembled slightly. "And I'm terrified of what I feel when I'm around you." He exhaled, the weight of the moment sinking into the room. "Then we're both terrified," he said. "But we're not alone in it." She laughed, a short, cracked sound. "You always know the right thing to say." "No," he said gently. "I just say the real thing. That's all I've got." A pause, a shift. She closed the gap between them, standing inches away. "What if I don't know how to be soft without breaking?" Eli reached out slowly, as if asking permission with his eyes before touching her cheek. "Then, I'll be the hand that steadies you." And just like that, she let go, not of control, but of the belief that she had to carry everything alone. That evening, a private company dinner was held in the rooftop atrium. Not for press, not for investors, just the leadership team and select guests. Camille hadn't planned on speaking, but when the room fell quiet and the team turned to her with the same look they always had, that mixture of awe, distance, and expectation, she stood up. This time, she didn't reach for her usual script. She reached inward. There was a time I believed being a CEO meant being the strongest person in the room. She began. The one who never faltered, never needed, never asked. The room stilled. But I've learned that true leadership means allowing yourself to be seen. To show up not just with plans, but with presence. Not just with answers, but with attention. She looked around the room. We will make mistakes. We will get tired. We will doubt. But if we choose to lead with care, if we choose to show up for each other, even when it's inconvenient, we won't just be building a company. We'll be building legacy. A quiet hush followed her words. Then applause, soft, rising, honest. Eli stood in the back watching her speak. She didn't see him, but she felt him. And as the night wore on, glasses clinked, laughter returned to the rooftop, and people found new conversations to wrap themselves in. Later, Camille found Eli on the outer terrace leaning against the railing, looking out at the skyline. She joined him in silence. After a while, he spoke. "You spoke like someone who finally believes they belong." She nodded, because someone finally stood still long enough for me to hear the echo. He looked at her then. "What do you hear now?" She turned toward him, her face open, luminous. "That I'm not building this alone anymore." A pause. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, an old brass compass. Slightly tarnished, but still shining in the moonlight. "It was my father's," she said. "He said it always brought him back to where he was meant to be." She held it out to him. "Now I want you to have it." Eli froze. "Camille." It's not a gift," she said gently. "It's a promise that wherever this leads, we'll both keep finding our way. Together." He took the compass, not because he needed direction, but because it meant he was part of her map. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the last one standing. She felt like someone who had finally arrived. And beside her stood the man who helped her get there, not by pushing or pulling, but by walking beside her, step by step, breath by breath. The first snow arrived unannounced. No grand flurry, no fanfare. Just a quiet hush that settled over the city like a blanket, softening the edges of rooftops and busy sidewalks. Outside Mercer Tower, even the traffic moved slower, as if the world had finally remembered to breathe. Inside, warmth hummed from floor lamps and idle computers, but on the 28th floor, Camille Mercer's office, something had changed. The desk was still there. So were the glass walls and the skyline view. But the room no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a living room. A little messy, a little real. And at the center of it, Camille sat cross-legged on the floor beside Lily Turner, 2 mugs of cocoa between them and a stack of old photos scattered in their laps. "Is that really your dad?" Lily asked, holding up a picture of Camille's father standing next to a teenage version of her grinning in braces. Camille laughed. "Yup. He had that mustache for most of my childhood. I thought he looked like a detective." "He kinda does," Lily said, then turned the photo sideways. "But you look different. Less serious." Camille tilted her head. "I think I was." Lily studied her, squinting slightly. "You're not as scary as people say you know." Camille raised a playful eyebrow. "People say I'm scary. Mr. Harris said you once fired a guy just by looking at him." Camille chuckled. "He quit, actually. But yes, I used to wear more eyeliner." Lily giggled, then leaned in close. "I like this, you better." Camille smiled softly. So do I. Just then, the door creaked open. Eli entered, brushing snowflakes off his coat, his cheeks flushed with cold. He froze when he saw the scene, his daughter and Camille knees touching, hands sticky with marshmallow laughter hanging like mist in the air. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Camille stood brushing crumbs off her jeans. "You're not?" He gave her a long look. "I brought the pie." "The good one?" Lily leapt up, pecan homemade, and still warm. She bolted toward him. "You're officially the best dad ever." He handed her the foil-wrapped pie and she disappeared down the hallway toward the kitchenette. Now it was just the two of them. Camille stepped closer. Eli looked around the office. "This place feels different." "So do I," she said. They stood in the golden quiet years of loneliness and healing between them. "You could have gone anywhere," she whispered. "You had job offers. Offers from companies I used to lose sleep over." "True," he nodded, "but none of them had Lily. Or you." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Are you sure she asked?" "About this about us." He stepped closer, his voice lower now. "Camille, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You don't scare me. Not the title, not the past, not even the eyeliner." She laughed, breath shaky. "What about the future?" Eli reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the brass compass she had given him weeks ago. Still slightly worn, still pointing somewhere. "Whatever direction this thing turns, I'm walking it with you." Her eyes shimmered. "You always know what to say." "No," he said, resting a hand on her cheek. "I just say the truth. That's all I've ever known with you." That evening, they walked out together, no longer two separate forces circling the same orbit, but one unit steady and whole. Outside, Lily threw a snowball at Eli's back and he retaliated with a perfectly aimed lob. Camille laughed, really laughed, as snow sprayed across her boots. They walked 3 blocks to a modest corner diner. Not a reservation-only place, just somewhere warm where the waitress remembered your name, and the pies came with a wink. At the booth, they shared fries and stories. Lily told Camille about a dream she had once where her dad married Wonder Woman. Camille replied, "Close enough," and Eli just shook his head. "Don't tell her that. She'll start wearing a cape to work." The waitress brought them hot cocoa without asking, and for a long, unmeasured while there was nothing but comfort. Joy in small doses. Healing disguised as ordinary life. Weeks later, Camille stood before a small crowd at a community school fundraiser. This time she didn't wear heels or a speech. She wore a soft blue sweater and jeans, and she held a check. A donation large enough to fund 6 new classrooms. But more than that, she held space. Space for single parents trying to stay afloat. For working moms who missed PTA meetings but never bedtime. For janitors like Eli once was, who carried dignity in every quiet hour they swept what others left behind. She spoke with no spotlight, just intention. And when she finished, she saw him in the back, Eli holding Lily's coat, his eyes never leaving her. At home that night, they curled up on the couch. Camille leaned against his shoulder, Lily asleep with a book half open in her lap. Snow danced outside the window. Inside, there was only peace. She whispered into the hush, "Do you think we'll make it?" Eli kissed the top of her head. "We already did." And as the night deepened and the city softened, the camera of life pulled slowly away from the small apartment with its warm lamp in the window from the couch where 3 hearts had finally come to rest from the love that needed no headlines, no titles, no performance, just presence. Because in the end, it wasn't about being saved. It was about being seen and loved, just as you are. And now I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching this story from? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Was there a moment that truly touched your heart? If this story moved you even just a little, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next heartfelt journey we share together. There's always another chapter waiting, and it might just change someone's life. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Your presence, your kindness, and your listening heart mean more than you know. Until next time, take care, stay kind, and keep believing in love.